nice to see everybody here. My name is Hollie Chessman. I'm Associate Director for Research at the American Council on Education. The American Council on Education is the major coordinating body for our nation's colleges and universities. We represent over 1,700 college and university presidents, as well as executive organization members. So my role is to set the stage a little bit with some data. And I'm going to lay a foundation, basically talking about who's coming to campus and what we're seeing on campus. And the rest of my colleagues will continue to build off of this presentation as well as Tabby's from this morning. There's not a typical student experience anymore, which used to be thought of as an 18-year-old graduating from college, going on campus and spending 4 years in college and then having a residential experience. Instead, only over 1 in 3 undergraduates are over the age of 25. Half of them are financially independent. Over 1 in 5 have children. Almost 1 in 4 are first-generation students. And over 6 out of 10 are working while they are enrolled. I'm sorry?
Could you go back to the previous slide? A couple of us want to take pictures of it.
Okay.
Thank you. Really fast.
This data is available on NIPSAS, which is the National Post-Secondary Study of Student Aid.
Thank you.
So I'm going to briefly present on some of the data from our race and ethnicity report that we published in 2019. First I want to make a few notes about the data because the report relies heavily on secondary data and most of it federal data. Our research team had to make a decision about how to work with the data and present the data that others had collected. Across 11 data sources used in this report, there were some differences in how race and ethnicity data were collected. And with that, for the vast majority of indicators, this report uses the 8 IPEDS-based race and ethnicity categories, which includes the category for those who identify as more than one race, and those who are considered non-resident aliens, whom we refer to as international faculty and students. As a research team, we recognize that the language that individuals and groups use to identify race and ethnicity has changed considerably throughout the history of the United States and continues to evolve. And so as a result, existing data here may not accurately reflect the current identity. Undergraduates, from what you can see in this slide, undergraduates in higher education are more ethnically and racially diverse than they were 20 years ago. Enrollment for students of color grew from 29.6% of undergraduates in 1995-1996 to an increase of 45.2, which is an increase of 15.6 percentage points. The group that has seen the largest increase in enrollment are Hispanic students with a 9.5 percentage increase. On this slide, you'll see that there's two pies. The one that's on my right and your left is the undergraduate enrollment by race and ethnicity from the previous slide for 2016-17. And as you can see from this slide, faculty and staff faculty are disproportionately white. Almost 20% of students enrolled as undergraduates in higher ed are Hispanic, which is considered the yellow section of the pie, and about 5% are full-time faculty that identify as Hispanic. A little over 15% of undergraduate students identify as Black or African American, which is the green section of the pie, and about 6% of full-time faculty in higher education identify as Black or African American. And this figure compares graduate student enrollment to full-time faculty. And while 32% of graduates are graduate students of color, 21% of full-time faculty are faculty of color. This slide parses out undergraduate enrollment and where students are enrolling. The largest share of underrepresented undergraduate students are attending public two-year colleges, represented by the red portion of the bar. And here you can see that larger shares of Hispanic, American Indian or Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander students are enrolled in community colleges compared to four-year public, private, and for-profit institutions. This slide shows the undergrad students who are considered low income. The federal government considers low income as those whose family income is at or below 150% of the federal poverty threshold. Over half of the American Indian or Alaskan Native and Hispanic students enrolled as undergraduates were considered low income, and close to 60% of Black or African American students are considered low income. And to put this into context, in 2019, for a family of 4 in the US, 150% of the federal poverty level was a household income of $38,500. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the mental health data and how what's might be appearing in our classrooms. It's important to look at students in our classrooms beyond their grades, and so we're going to look at some data from the Healthy Minds study. And Tabby touched on this. Healthy Minds network is located here at the University of Michigan, and they've been collecting data on the mental health of students since 2007. One of the unique features of this particular tool is that it uses clinically validated measures to measure different experiences that students are having. I need to mention just a caveat before diving into some of this data. The data is descriptive, and it is from the Healthy Minds data tool, which you can find on their website. The data around students who identify as Native American, Pacific Islander, or Arab American have similar sample sizes in the Healthy Minds study, or smaller sample sizes in the Healthy Minds study. So the data should be interpreted with some caution. This slide shows the prevalence of flourishing by race, racial, and ethnic group. Included in the Healthy Minds brief study is a brief 8-item measure that measures respondent self-perceived success in important areas such as relationships, self-esteem, purpose, and optimism. This scale provides a single psychological well-being score. And as you can see in this slide, there has been a nearly 20% drop in the average number of students who are reporting flourishing compared to 2012. And nearly half that drop is accounted for between the 2015 and 2016 school year. Probably not a surprise to some of us, especially given what Tabby talked about with the racial campus climate incidents increasing since the presidential election. Students who identify as Pacific Islander, Native American, and Asian American are reporting the lowest levels of flourishing in 2019, while Black students are reporting the highest levels of flourishing among the racial and ethnic groups here. This slide shows the differences from the previous slide between the data starting in 2012 and ending in 2019. Students who identify as Pacific Islander or Hispanic saw the largest drops in flourishing, about a 26.2 or a 23.5 decline respectively, while students who identified as Asian and Asian American saw the smallest drop in flourishing, a 16.4% drop. But as a group, they also report lower levels of psychological well-being than other racial and ethnic groups. As we have seen with the decline of students who report that they are flourishing since 2012, each year since 2012 has also seen more students with moderate, severe, or mild depression as measured by the Patient Health Questionnaire 9 or PHQ-9 clinical tool. The increase in students reporting depression were smaller for 2014, 15, and the 16 years, but however, at every subsequent year since 2016, there's been an increase in reported depression by an average of 4.3% across all racial and ethnic groups. In 2019, students who identified as Pacific Islander, Native American, or Arab American reported being depressed more frequently, while students who identify as Asian or Asian American or white reported being depressed less frequently. Along with an increase in depression, the Healthy Minds is also reporting an increase in anxiety. While it is rising at a lower rate than depression, each year since 2013 has seen more students on average as having positive anxiety screenings. In 2019, students who identified as Pacific Islander, Native American, or Arab American, or Hispanic screened positive for anxiety at higher rates than other racial and ethnic groups. Taken together, students reporting anxiety and depression has steadily increased over the 2010 decade. And while students who report flourishing has seen a marked increase, and we see a lot of the increases or decreases happening with the 2016 academic year. This slide talks a little bit about perceived stigma and public stigma. The Healthy Minds instrument actually asks students to respond to the following statements on a Likert scale. To measure personal stigma, they ask, I would think less of students have to respond to this actual statement. I would think less of someone who received mental health treatment. That's personal stigma. And then the perceived stigma measurement is most people would think less of someone who received mental health treatment. And the data on this slide show that students who have higher levels of perceived health stigma than how they actually feel personally about mental health treatment. You can see the difference that's on this slide. There's a significant gap. In 2019, students who identify as Black have higher levels of perceived stigma and Asian Americans have the highest level of personal stigma. These are important to think about in relationship to health-seeking behaviors. And here's the data that in 2019 displayed a different way. With personal stigma in blue and public stigma in red, there's a big difference between what they think and what they think others think of those who receive mental health treatment. So how is this showing up on campus? ACE did a survey of college and university presidents in 2019. In April, we asked about 2,000 presidents, and we received a response, 420 responded. And we asked them, what are they seeing around mental health on their own campuses? So I'm just going to briefly touch on those findings. We asked residents how frequently they were hearing reports of students with mental health concerns on their campus. In this survey, 1/3 of the presidents actually reported hearing about students with mental health concerns about once a week. And 40% of presidents acknowledge the frequency as a few times a month. And this means that over 60% of presidents are hearing about students with mental health concerns a few times a month or more. When presidents were asked about what issues they're hearing the most about on campus, they indicated anxiety and depression, followed by addiction, food insecurity, and suicide. And finally, in light of all the trends we are seeing, over 80% of presidents report that student well-being is part of their strategic plan, which is a promising step in helping address student mental health and well-being on campus, especially for students of color. Thank you for your time. If you're interested in learning more about our survey, you can, our report on race and ethnicity in higher education, please visit our website, which is www.equityinhighered.org. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hollie, for laying the foundation and presenting statistics to us and really driving home the purpose of this conference, the need to discuss mental health among our students of color on college campuses. Now we're going to turn our attention to a presentation by Christine Asidao. Christine is the Associate Director at the Counseling and Psychological Services here at the University of Michigan. This presentation will be co-presented by Todd Sevig, Director at the Counseling and Psychological Services, also here at the University of Michigan. Thank you.
So Christine and I are going to tag team and do this together, as we do everything almost. So it's wonderful to be here. As this was just said, my name's Todd, and I'm the Director of our Student Counseling Center here on campus, which we call CAPS. And the handle for this panel is how can we help students in the classroom? What can faculty do, graduate student instructors? And the reason we're here is we have rolled out a specific intervention, which you see the picture of the cover, in which we have copies for everybody. So we're not exactly sure where they are, so, but they'll arrive. And it's called the toolkit, as you can see, to help create a campus, an environment, climate, all those things that Tabby just talked about, supportive of student mental health. So I'm going to start with just a few minutes about why we did this. So you can see some of the words up there. We've had this idea for a while. We get a lot of calls and interest and talks with faculty about wanting to do something, wanting to help in the classroom, and yet sometimes feeling like they don't have the tools. They don't have the specifics on what they could do. And so that's been floating around in our heads for a while, including helping students who are from underrepresented groups, students of color, on a predominantly white campus. You have to remember, when you work in a counseling center, for us, we see about 5,000 students a year just in individual counseling. We encounter thousands of more students in the outreach work that we do. And so we hear stories. Every person's life is worth a novel. And so we're privileged to be part of this novel and their experience on campus. And to be a student of color on our campus is the title of this conference. Gifted, at risk, full of resilience. Think about the opening words that we all heard. For us, and how that interacts with our mental health is, think about students walking around every day when they get up in the morning, throughout the day, carrying all that in their heads and their hearts, and also trying to learn chemistry and calculus in these environments. So everything that we do is based on social justice in the counseling center, and this toolkit comes from that place. It comes from the place of our orienting values, our mission, our role, our mindset, our heart set. It comes from data. So Tabby presented a lot of data. We've also done surveys. For those of you who love numbers, I can send that after this program. Simply, students' experiences of discrimination in a survey we did 2 years ago are highly correlated with experiences of not just anxiety and depression, but other mental health issues. So what's going on with that? What's underneath all the anxiety and the depression? We think, and part of our intent with this toolkit, is that good mental health can only happen in an environment that's free of oppression, free of isms, and where each of us can be in our identities to be ourselves. So yes, the toolkit, look at number 2, provides practical tips on how to identify, how to notice, how to help a student who may be struggling. We did focus groups with faculty. We did a lot of work with our student advisory board and students to culminate in what is being passed up to all of you in this toolkit. It came from research, came from elements of positive psychology. So any good intervention is going to be effective on multiple layers. So yes, it helps with the facts. Here's the counseling center. Here's how to refer. But equally, and arguably more important, we are trying to create an academic environment supportive of the college student mental health. And ultimately, that last bullet point, we're out to change the world. We've always had that as our beacon. To create a community of caring, encompassing of mental health, where each student can say, again, in their identities, I matter, I belong in this class, because we know that we learn best in an environment, in a climate that has all these elements. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine, and I do have some vocal cord challenges, so if you need for me to repeat anything, please just let me know. All right. I'm going to briefly go over a little bit about the University of Michigan mental health landscape. So I have some information here. This is from our annual report. This is data from our 2018 to 2019 academic year. This is the breakdown in regards to students accessing services at our counseling center. One of the things I wanted to highlight was that 39% of our clients identify as students of color. There is something really important in regards to that one of our biggest goals is really reaching out to the variety of communities out there in order to reduce stigma, in order to increase accessibility to our services. And so for us, this is really important data. I want to give a little bit of context as well. So again, the idea of multiple social identities is so important. We do not just exist in these vacuums. It is sort of the intersection in regards to our variety of identities. And this is a little bit more of a context in regards to the students who are coming in for our services. A couple things I just want to point out. Almost 20% of the students who seek out services are first-generation college students. Another big one that really stood out, almost 40% of the students that we see for clinical services have experienced a traumatic event, and trauma is broadly defined. Another thing, in terms of suicidal thoughts in the past year, that's around 14%. Again, this is just a snapshot of 1 year. In regards to reasons for services, when we looked at our students of color as well as our students who identify as white, these are the top 5 concerns. They are pretty similar across the board, except for the 4th one, where for our students of color, academic performance is actually in the top 5, whereas it is not for our white students. In their top 5, it is stress. So getting into the toolkit, I believe everyone has received this. This really is for our faculty members. There is a reason why that this was very much focused on our faculty. We kept hearing story after story from our students, from our undergraduate students, from our graduate professional students. Context matters, our culture matters. What is the impact of our faculty members on our own mental health and well-being? And so we really wanted to listen to that. And we also really wanted to listen to our faculty members. And so yes, we did do focus groups. We did a series of 5 focus groups representing the various schools and colleges across the university. What works in the campus environment? What works in our academic environments? And so really bringing that together and leaning into the data as well. And so these 5 bullets, these are actual tabs in the faculty toolkit. Yes, we have things on how to help a student in distress, what are those specific steps you need to take, but these are the 5 content areas that our students have said, these things really matter. This is going to help me feel like I belong in the classroom. This is going to make me feel like I matter in the classroom. And so things like how to build an inclusive classroom. And we are not expecting our faculty members to become mental health professionals and to really lean into all of this data and apply it. We are giving very concrete behavioral tools so that they can implement them. They can pick and choose. And so building that sense of connection from day one is important. How to incorporate mindfulness and stress reduction. Some of our students talked about faculty members just incorporating a 2-minute brain break, where they could just either stretch or they can maybe look on their phone for a bit. That really helped them stay engaged for a 3-hour lecture, right? Increasing resilience and self-compassion. The self-compassion piece is really important. Todd had mentioned that we do a mental health survey every couple of years. We actually focused on self-compassion a couple of years ago, and what we found was that students across the board, if they scored higher on self-compassion, they scored lower across levels of anxiety, depression, social anxiety, all of our mental health scales. That really matters. So again, how can we help our faculty members incorporate self-compassion into the classroom? Then we talk about growth and mindset, and then this last one, what else should I consider? And so this is just like the illustrations, and again, all of these were very intentional in terms of even our student illustrator really talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, making sure we're really representing our University of Michigan campus in the best way that we can. I'm just going to go down to the what else should I consider piece. This is where the context really matters. We are not only asking our faculty members to be aware of our students' backgrounds, students of color. We heard quite a bit about this earlier this morning in terms of being the only one, the impact of microaggressions, racist acts, stereotyping, discrimination, and there are other multiple social identities involved. So how does that intersect with being a first-generation college student and maybe not having the same models that other peers have experienced in regards to academic success? We also talk about invisible and visible disabilities. Are we able to design universal design classrooms, academic settings? Are we paying attention to the fact that we have a spectrum of neurodiversity available to us? And how does that impact then our various social identities? And so it's thinking about the student, but then we're also asking our faculty members to reflect on their own multiple social identities. Where are they coming from? How are their values and beliefs being affected? How are their multiple social identities affecting the way they think about help seeking, how they think about mental health? How is that going to impact a possible discussion they might have with a student who is struggling? And so these are some of the pieces that we're really trying to put across. So,
That's it. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing this valuable tool for us because sometimes I think we don't know how to even start the conversation. So a tool like this, I believe, helps faculty know how to start the conversations around mental health, inclusion, and helping students belong on campus. Next we have Charisma Collette, Assistant Director at the Center for Research on Teaching and Learning here at the University of Michigan.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Karishma. I'm an assistant director at CRLT, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today talking about how instructors, faculty and other instructors can support students through their approach to course design. I want to very briefly share a little bit about my professional background in student advising and student support. I spent many years as a graduate student instructor here at the University of Michigan, where I was doing a lot of one-on-one work, mentoring, teaching, coaching undergraduate students. I also was an academic advisor for students interested in health careers at the Noonan Advising Center, and a program manager at the Science Learning Center. These experiences have been really foundational for me in understanding the student experience here on campus. Many of my students were students of color, and it was incredibly valuable for me to hear, as Todd and Christine said, stories of how students navigate this campus and the challenges that they overcome. In 2017, I moved to the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, and I have, at CRLT, worked extensively with faculty in helping them enhance their inclusive teaching approaches, particularly in courses that are large introductory courses that students often perceive to be the weeding out courses. I feel like both of these, I consider my experiences kind of two sides of a coin, very intimately working with students and then very closely working with faculty. And I feel like it's given me a really valuable perspective on course design and how that impacts the mental health and student experience on campus. Tabby did a really fantastic job laying the context for this, this slide that I have up on how students of color experience and have to navigate many identity-based challenges that exacerbate their mental health distress. I'm not going to go over that again, but I will say that even in the microclimate of the classroom, there are many, many experiences that students navigate that stem from interactions not only with the instructor, but also with other students. So this looks like stereotyping and stereotype threat, a lot of microaggressions, a lot of resistance of students not wanting to work with other students of color in the classroom. It's multidimensional. I also want to say that in conversations with students, there is this lack of finding community in the classroom and a really difficulty finding mentors and role models who share similar identities. And that definitely plays a role in a feeling of isolation and loneliness for students of color in particular. For the rest of my time talking today, I am going to focus on work I did with two wonderful colleagues, Sarah Armstrong and Christy Simonian-Bean, who is here in the audience, working on how course design, how instructors can support students who are facing mental health challenges. And we did write a paper that came out about a year ago in 2018. I don't have copies of the paper, but it is CRLT Occasional Paper number 38, and it is available online for you. In this paper, the reason we worked on this paper is because there was a need on campus from both students and instructors to provide instructors with the skill set to knowledgeably and compassionately respond when students approach them with mental health concerns. And this is work that we did in close collaboration with CAPS as well. So I want to just highlight a couple pieces of background and research from this paper before I move into concrete strategies. So as we heard this morning, students of color are less likely to seek help for mental health challenges compared to white peers. We have data from U of M about Asian and Asian American students who are least likely to utilize mental health services and also most likely to report higher levels of self-stigma and perceived stigma around seeking psychological help. From studies with the Steve Fund and the JED Foundation, there is also data to show that students of color report higher levels of emotional distress in their first year, but they are half as likely as white counterparts to seek help. As you can imagine, academic work can play and does play a big role in causing and exacerbating student mental health concerns. So this is data from U of M. The Central Student Government, the Mental Health Task Force of the Central Student Government in 2017 found that academic difficulty is a primary reason why students solicit professional support for mental health. And this was then reinforced in 2018 when the NCHA survey showed that 48% of respondents reported that their academics, they found them to be traumatic or very difficult to handle. The reason this becomes critically important is that through their approach to course design, when instructors think about assessments and the format of their course, they can make a very big positive impact in proactively supporting student mental health. So I'd just like to highlight a few things from this paper, and again, I encourage you to read it. There are a lot of concrete strategies. Including language about mental health support in syllabi and other student-facing materials is one very concrete way in which instructors can show their support for mental health and well-being for students. The Central Student Government has very helpfully actually drafted language that instructors can just copy and paste into their syllabus. Instructors can also explicitly promote self-care and wellness. And this again can look like, there's a variety of ways to do this. Instructors could check in with students around particularly stressful times in the semester when they have, a big assignment has been due, for example, or it's midterm season. Talking with students about the importance of sleep and diet. Sharing videos on Canvas, or even in the big auditoriums, instructors can put up information on slides as students are walking in about CAPS has relaxation zones, CAPS has wellness videos, Wolverine Wellness offers free one-on-one coaching. These are all resources on campus that students might not know about, but instructors can do important work in sharing and spreading awareness about it. I want to highlight that these two topics, sharing information about mental health in various ways, not only normalizes the challenge around mental health that students might be feeling, but also makes the instructor more approachable. I am much more, as a student, I might be much more willing to approach somebody who has talked about mental health and who has shared that this is not a unique challenge on campus. So it does a lot to build trust and rapport as well. And finally, I want to echo what Christine said about we don't want instructors and faculty to be mental health professionals or to diagnose in any way, but we do want them to be attentive to changes in student behavior. As a faculty member, as an instructor, you have this unique vantage point of seeing your students three times a week sometimes. And so being attentive to, are they suddenly appearing more anxious about grades? Are they suddenly not showing up to class or coming in late every day? And again, this is things that you don't have to assume that this is due to a mental health concern, but you could check in with the student and say, I'm observing X, Y, and Z. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I want to emphasize that through course design, you actually have to make yourself available to students to be able to notice these things. So staying in a little bit after class, coming early, having really supporting the idea of students coming to office hours. These are all ways that you can make yourself available so that you can then be attentive to changes in student behavior. I also want to talk a little bit, again, like Christine and Todd did, about promoting a growth mindset and normalizing academic struggle. Again, many ways to do this. I'll just talk about a few. Talking about and making visible the effort that is required to master disciplinary skills and rigorous course material. Again, this looks like sharing with your students at the onset of the semester that you should go to the Sweetland Writing Center, you should go to the Science Learning Center, so that students see this not as something remedial, but in fact as something very normal and good that any student would want to do. Talking about, when you're doing problem-solving sessions, really walking through with students, verbalizing your thought process, sharing with them ideas, places where a lot of students may struggle. Those are, again, ways to show that struggle is a normal part of learning and a step on the way to mastery. A lot of faculty members may also feel like it is useful to share with students experiences that they had in the past around failure and around struggle. And I would say that that's a powerful strategy. I will also say, however, that that might be a strategy that feels more or less available to an instructor depending on their identity. When I was an advisor, I would share with students I trusted, many of them students of color, that, I struggled with this. I really underperformed during my undergraduate. I would share that because I have trust. But if it was someone I was meeting for the first time, as a woman of color in STEM, I would be much more careful. And I'd say, oh, this is something many students struggle with, or you are not alone in this. So sharing about personal struggle is something that instructors can choose to do when there is a relationship of trust or rapport. The second point about creating structured opportunities for students to reflect on challenges is really, again, about emphasizing that you can struggle and you should struggle when you are learning. And there are ways to help students see that mistakes are normal and natural. So two strategies that I have often talked about with instructors is this idea of the muddiest point. So when you have a discussion or a class, you can ask students at the end of the course, at the end of that session, to write down anonymously, what is one thing you're still unclear about or confused about from this hour of discussion. And that helps students see that it's okay to be confused about something, and it's okay to think about things you still have to work on. A lot of instructors will also do things called exam wrappers, which is after an exam, they ask students to reflect on how did you study for this? How did you prepare for this? And that reflective activity can, again, help students see that this is an ongoing process, that they weren't just supposed to get it and know how to get it, but in fact, it is something you learn along the way. This final point is really around the overall design of assessments in the course. Many of the instructors and many of the students I've worked with will say, there's just 3 exams in this course. If I do really badly in the first one, it feels like I'm lost. I don't have a chance to get back in the game. And so this third point really speaks to the idea of building a course with frequent assessments that are smaller so that students have a chance to make a comeback. And then also for the assessments to kind of build on each other so that I might submit a draft as part 1 of an assignment, get feedback on that, and be able to incorporate that feedback as I continue to go through the semester. That was a lot about proactive strategies for course design. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about when you have a student who comes to you and shares that they are struggling with mental health, what are some ways to effectively respond as an instructor? Again, not putting on the hat of a mental health professional, but in the instructor role. It is important to communicate concern for the student's well-being, even though your primary responsibility is academic. So instead of jumping straight to, well, let's figure out the academic piece, taking the time to thank them for sharing, to acknowledge that this is a difficult time in their life, to really check in with them about how they are doing, just in terms of their mental health, not really touching on the academic piece. This is also a point where an instructor who is aware of the mental health support that is available on campus, that's really important, because if a student comes to me and I have no idea where to direct them, it's not very helpful for the student who's come to me out of trust and vulnerability. providing a balance between accountability and flexibility. The idea behind this is just to not overpromise that everything will be okay and that they won't have consequences for academics, but to be knowledgeable about the different policies and the different options that might be available to the student at that time. It's all case by case. There is no perfect answer, and every student's situation is different. But not over-promising, I think, it's really important, and also making sure that you are guiding the student through the various options available to them, but collaborating with them in making the decision rather than saying, this is what you need to do. And then finally, I touched on this a little bit. I work with instructors to help them see that being knowledgeable about the various mental health resources available on campus is part of their preparation for teaching, and also acknowledging that there is no one size fits all. So I may want to do A, B, and C instead of X, Y, and Z because of cost, because of convenience, because there are backgrounds of the counselors in one place might better match what I need. So just the knowledge and the ability to really serve as a resource for students is important with mental health options. I want to end here with just something I have tried to do for myself, is that as an advisor and then even earlier as an instructor, when a student of color comes to us and shares a concern that they're having about a campus incident, about a classroom incident, about mental health, continuing to be reflective and learn about how are we responding when they come to us, how are we being supportive, instead of saying, well, how can I help you? Which is such a natural thing to say, but it puts the onus back on the student, and really they're looking at you for help. So being knowledgeable and informed about how you can best support them is really critical. Thank you.
Jay Burns, Assistant Professor of Nursing. Take it over.
Good. Okay. Right. Okay. So yeah, and I'm in the Department of Health Behavior and Biological Sciences, so that's probably what's in your book. How many of you are like a clinician of some sort, like social work or psychology or nursing? I see nursing back here. So I'm going to talk about the experience, of students of color, role of faculty in supporting their mental health. But I just wanted to let you know a little bit about myself. I am a PhD prepared nurse researcher, and I'm here as an assistant professor at the university. But clinically, I have been in nursing since 2006, and so I've been at the bedside, and I'm also a nurse practitioner. And I've been teaching for a very long time, and now I'm doing both the research piece. So you're gonna learn about nursing. But some of the things that I'm going to tell you are very transferable to your own discipline, but I'm going to give you both sides because I have been a student and now I'm a faculty person. And those who are in clinical settings, they have actually two spaces that they have to really think about, and it may cause some anxiety and stress for students. Nursing students and other healthcare professions, they have to perform in the classroom, and they also have to perform in the clinical setting. So those are two spaces where they're kind of constantly going back and forth about who they are, and it can cause some stress. Just a few facts. Overall, 3.8 million. There are 3.8 million registered nurses nationwide. We are the largest healthcare profession of any health discipline. We are, according to several polls, we are the #1 trusted provider, and in part because we spend a lot of time with our patients. In terms of the workforce, I'm not sure if you know. Some people do, some people don't. But at nursing, you can get an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's, and you have clinical doctorates, and you have research doctorates. And so, with the workforce, 64.2% of nursing workforce is prepared at the bachelor's level, and then or higher. Which breaks down as follows: 45.2% have the Bachelor's of Science in Nursing, 17.1% with the Master's, 1.2% with the clinical doctorate, and then 0.6% with the PhD. So I highlighted because I'm in that 0.6%. Which lets you know that it's obviously work in any field, but it's lower in that particular field. In terms of racial, ethnic background, the RN population is comprised of 80.8% of white Caucasian, 6.2% of African American, 7.5% of Asian, 5.3% of Hispanic Latinx, less than 1% in Native American, Indian, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. And that was the most recent statistics from the American Association of College of Nursing. I would like to say this. So a lack of minority nurse educators may send a signal to potential students that nursing does not value diversity or offer career ladder opportunities to advance through the profession. Students looking for academic role models to encourage and enrich their learning may be frustrated in their attempts to find mentors and community of support. So nurses generally work and then become, they generally work in the clinical setting and then go on to become faculty members. So in my role, I'm not gonna say my age, but the assistant professors are 51, according to the AAC, and 51 years old. By the time you become a tenured professor or a full professor, they're about 63 years old. And so when you're teaching, yes, almost a shit there, like yes. So it's different than other disciplines when they come right out and they get their PhD. So I'll talk a little bit about like the generational piece, which I think is very important. So from a faculty perspective, racial and ethnic composition of college faculty has not really increased in the last 20 years. And as far as the academic pipeline, recruitment and hiring processes or practices are sometimes outdated. And we don't know as much about, in terms of faculty, how to retain them, they're at much lower rates than what we know about the majority faculty. So from a student's perspective, so what causes stress, anxiety, and some of the things that you have to think about as being a student? Well, first off, if you're here at the university, I don't know how many people are actually from here at Michigan, you have about 30,000 students coming to this university, right? And then you think about the School of Nursing, we only admit about 110 students in a cohort, somewhere between 110, 130, and we have people who transfer over in their sophomore year. Moving back to the PowerPoint, in terms of faculty, students of color understand on the level of the lived experience that the lack of faculty of color diminishes their sense of belonging on predominantly white campuses, eroding their resilience and how they resolve over time. So this is different than like when we look at like from an African American or Black perspective, if you go to a historically Black college and university and how you are taught and trained at that institution, then you maybe go to graduate school and you come over here. There's a different level of confidence in terms of how the student can identify this. And I don't want to say there's less stress, but there's more confidence on that end. Academic motivation and persistence among those underrepresented students are often undermined by feelings of self-doubt, lack of belongingness, and stereotype threats in classrooms where they are significantly outnumbered by majority students, excuse me. So feeling like isolated, feeling like the only one, those things can cause a lot of anxiety in terms of the student's process. Again, I already talked about lack of faculty of color represented, gender challenges. Nursing in each health discipline is different. Nursing is a female-dominated profession. So imagine the student coming in as a male, but a Black male or a Latinx male that's coming in. So you have to deal with not only your color, but your gender and that aspect too. So first generation and economic challenges. So first generation, so you're dealing with a big university, you're dealing with your roommates and those type of things. And then you come over to nursing, which is a very locked curriculum, very heavy in science. Like my sophomore students this year, they have pathophysiology and microbiology tests on the same day and those type of things. And not being able to talk to someone back at home about what you're really going through is very troubling and sometimes you wonder. And in terms of economic challenges, so nurses, they don't just come in like regular clothes. They have to have scrubs and jackets, and they have to purchase stethoscopes and all this medical equipment that outside of books and those type of things that they have to purchase, and that can be also stressful. I do not have it on here, but suburban versus urban experiences. So like if someone is coming from a suburban environment and someone's coming from a city environment, not everybody's from Detroit or Philly or those type of things. And putting in those things and lumping them in one category in terms of what is your experience in terms of being a student. But what we do know is that, when faculty of color are there, they do better on tests. They are more likely to insert their own experiences and do peer-oriented or challenge some of those those stories, case studies, those type of things, make them more of a learning experience for those students who are. So I'm just going to flip through this real quick. Perils, pitfalls, and pearls. So I just wanted to focus on like the generational differences. And I already talked about like the age in terms of some professors, instructors are different. But like I'm on the millennial cusp, and how I think of things and what I do to relax may be different than someone on the other generational side. And so we got to think about those things and how like for each discipline they traditionally value. Some of those things change. Listening, respecting individuals, learning how to communicate with people one-on-one is very important. Sometimes you can't communicate in large groups, and you just have to talk to individuals or small groups to get the point across. So here are my solutions, and some of these you may or may not find helpful. But again, it's imperative to retain faculty of color, working in smaller study groups, having a chief diversity officer. So I don't know what each school or college or university is like, but I know in our school we have a chief diversity officer who's an advocate for students, an advocate for mental health, an advocate for understanding the stresses that goes along with being not just a student of color, looking at LGBTQ issues, looking at first generation, SES, or socioeconomic status experiences. And so we have a couple of pages that are devoted for prospective students, current students, faculty, so that we can understand how we can handle some of these situations. My CRLT colleague, Ms. Colette, like I've gone through their program, and they've really helped me as a faculty person. Teaching scripts are often used in clinical settings where you have like 5 minutes, you can talk about a topic, say diabetes or whatever it is, pneumonia, and you can add those cultural elements in there. Same thing with the 1-minute preceptor. You would go into a situation, and I'm just talking about in clinical spaces, and you come out and take care of a patient, and we talk about in 1 minute, like what did you learn about this scenario? Helping correct language and documentation and charting. So we go out, like I have undergrads right now, and so they have like this big exam next week about systems. So they're learning how to examine like the head, ears, eyes, nose, throat, musculoskeletal system. But we got the skin. Skin is a system too. And so when you chart, you say like a patient's skin is clean, dry, and intact, normal for color. Well, what does that mean? Like race, ethnicity? And then I'm like, well, what about me? How would you document me? You know, like, and just kind of breaking the ice in terms of how to like figure out a better way to chart, and then we'll write it in the board. Because they have to do that when they get in the hospital setting, and I'm not going to be there. And you need to do it appropriately. Case studies, looking at those before they hit the curriculum, or before, like, we have folders on Canvas where I can look at some of the things, and I can add to whatever I need to in terms of their learning. Cultural sensitivity, where we move beyond the competence, and we just have to acknowledge that. I mean, you can't really measure the competence at this point because you have so much to do. But understanding that each situation is different, understanding that just with the respect that things are different for each person, their identities, and those type of things. Racial socialization. So we look at this in like, this is kind of parallel, like in terms of like African Americans and how we educate our young men, like how to deal with the police, how to deal with you know, things that may happen. And so when these events occur, they're strong, they understand. It's the same thing when I'm going into the clinic. You have the anxiety of trying to figure out how to deal with that patient, but not every patient is going to want to see you. I've had people reject me as a nurse and say, oh, I don't want her, you know. Well, you know what, you're just going to have to pay for 2 hours then, because the next person is, you know, so turning those things into light and saying that it's not going to be perfect every time. Like I've had instances when I was a student, people thought that I was housekeeping, you know, not understanding that I was a nurse. They drilled me through all these things, and then, you know, education. And then finally they're like, well, why are you here? And I'm like, well, because I want to take care of you. I want to take care of my people. I want to make sure that you have the best care possible. So letting students know that people are going to question you. People are not going to want your care sometimes. But it doesn't matter. People need to see people that look like you, and you can't fixate on those things. You can't fixate in terms of trying to understand why people do that. You need to move through the process and not get anxious about it. Think globally and be available. I send like blanket emails, like I BCC people, and I'm like, I hate like a bunch of people because I don't have time to do like 20 minutes. I'm thinking about you, you know, like, hope everything's okay, you know, and sometimes I'll say, you know, don't forget to sleep, don't forget to rest, don't forget to eat. Here's some social media, like, tags, like some memes that you can look to kind of decrease some of those feelings that you have about before the test or whatever exams you have. And so here are some of the resources, and I don't know, like, at my level when I was a PhD student, I looked, a PhD project looks at, they highlight all, it's on LinkedIn, it's on social media, their own website and everything, but it looks at different faculty in terms of their successes, and so you have role models there. Then there's different online community groups that have motivational quotes, things to just decrease stress with a student. And then the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, they have also workshops for faculty and staff. Nursing Profession Diversity Resources, that is one of the pages on the University of Michigan School of Nursing's website. And so we have culture champions in our schools. We have like different organizations like Men in Nursing. We also have a data dashboard to monitor how many students are coming in. And then other resources to provide are things like, and you may or may not know this if you are already here, but like the Trotter House, Expect, Respect, CAPS. I don't know what you guys are doing, but I got about 5 of your books already. So I've looked through them and they're very helpful, and it might be because I'm in different venues beyond nursing, and which speaks a lot that you're getting the message out in terms of here's your resource and how to use it. So that's all I have to say. That's my contact information. I hope that I provided some insight in terms of your discipline, and I hope you learned a little bit about nursing. Thank you.
But I do appreciate this concept of, as the two previous presenters challenged us to do, which was to respond knowledgeably and compassionately. And even when we think about students in professional programs, social work and nursing, there is an even greater need for us to remind them to, as they are compassionate to their clients or patients, to also be compassionate to themselves. And so our last presenter, Kira Banks, Associate Professor of Psychology, visiting us from St. Louis University.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I know that you're ready to get going to lunch and breakout. So I'm actually taking a slightly different angle, which I think it's beautiful how we've built on each other. I want us to think about some of what Tabby was saying in terms of, rather than thinking about how do we fix the student and what do we do in terms of fit, in terms of student, how do we think about the structures? And then as a professor, how do I think about what I have control over and what power I have in the classroom? So I am from St. Louis, and as we know, if we think about like timing of some of the incidents that Tabby mentioned that have been happening on college campuses, clearly Mike Brown's murder in St. Louis in 2014 was a flashpoint moment for St. Louis University. We actually just last week had the 5-year anniversary of what we call Occupy SLU, where a number of activists in the community, some of which were SLU students, St. Louis University, we call ourselves SLU, came onto campus and occupied the campus for about, I should know how many days, a number of days. And a number of dialogues ensued, and an agreement we call the Clock Tower Accords was created. But I say all that to say I do research on discrimination and how it impacts mental health, and have for now 20 years, and became a consultant for the Ferguson Commission that was happening post the Ferguson uprising. And we pushed our region to really think about, like, what does racial equity mean, right? And so in thinking about this work, I mean, I've been a college professor for a long time now, and thinking about the student experience, but doing this work in an applied way, I think it's important for us to connect, and Tabby did a little bit of that, Rob did as well, this idea of equity in education. And the Steve Fund talks about this as well. And what's real is that race and ethnicity influences how people fare in the classroom. We know this. We've heard multiple ways in which that happens. And I think what's important is that we understand not necessarily what's happening about them, but what's happening in the structure. So people have seen this meme, right? My critique of this is that this suggests that there's something deficient about that third person. In this case, they're short. There's nothing deficient about being short. But in this case, in trying to talk about why we need equity, we're saying, oh, well, there's something about that person, and so we need to give them 2 risers. And I reject that idea, the deficit model. I actually think that this does a better job of reflecting what we need to do and how we need to frame things. That it's not that there's something deficient about that person, it's that we've actually created a different built landscape underneath them. And that we need to be extremely reflective about that landscape and the structures and the infrastructure, not what's going on with that person. Because if we're honest about the infrastructure, that calls us to accountability to give those risers, not because it's something about them or, oh, we feel sorry for them because they're short, right? Culturalorganizing.org is where this comes from, and they have a whole article on the different ways that people have represented equity and equality. You might have seen the bicycle example, right? But for me, thinking about my responsibility for the mental health of students of color in the classroom, I think it's incumbent upon me as the professor to think about that built landscape and to not just focus on what the student needs to do differently or what they need to do better or even how I support them. Of course, all important things, but I have control and I have power in the environment. And so I want to first start talking a little bit about some of the external factors, which we've heard about and throughout today. But to just name that, you know, campus climate, as Tabby so eloquently talked about the complexity, structural stigma, Hotzenbuehler in 2016 talks about the structural stigma that's swirling around students, swirling around all of us, really, that's in our systems, the narratives they get told about them, right, that you might not belong in a certain place, so kind of getting at the fit. Instructor bias, to be really clear. We know, I've seen fewer studies at the university level, but we know from educational research K through 12 that the same behavior is done by a student of color and a white student, and that same behavior is seen as more egregious. And so the need for discipline is higher, right? And so how is that happening in the college class? Well, I would imagine in ways like, I need an extension, right? So how am I making assumptions about why this student needs an extension versus another? Am I holding it against them in a different way, right? So being real honest about myself as an instructor and how that shapes a student's experience. And then these local and national incidents and dynamics. Tabby showed many of the headlines, and so I'll speak personally about St. Louis University. When Occupy SLU happened, when the uprising was happening, we had students who were leaders in the movement, who would be out in the streets at night and then at class the next day, and professors who were not even acknowledging that there was activism happening on our campus. Literally, you're stepping over activists and occupation, the Occupy SLU, and professors are like not talking about it, as if it didn't happen, as if the door closed and there was nothing occurring. And so it reminds me that as professors, we need to acknowledge not only that the world is happening outside of our doors and that students are involved in it, but also, like Hollie mentioned, the student who is coming to college is so different than it was historically, right? They're not in a bubble. They're working, they're engaged, they're doing so much. And I remember personally one night being at a protest and coming to campus the next day to do a interview with a potential faculty member, and it was a rough night. And a faculty member kind of coming by who was in my area and asking, how was your night? Today's such a beautiful day. And I'm thinking, is there any space for me to tell you what last night really was like? Right, like to be tear gassed in my own neighborhood, right, which ended up ensuing to a federal injunction because our police were acting in such egregious ways, right? There was a lot that was happening. So as a faculty member, I can manage myself and navigate, and I have supports. But as a student, right, how hard would that be to walk in and have someone completely ignore what happened and say, okay, now you must perform on this test that really means nothing in the context of what's happening in the world, right? So I think we have to do our work as professors and faculty to be aware of what students are experiencing. And then so I want to touch briefly on the internal factors, because again, I want us to think about as faculty, what's that built landscape and what we can control, and not focus so much on what the student needs to fix. But as a psychological researcher, I'm very interested in individual differences, and I know that discrimination impacts mental health and that we have some knowledge about factors that can buffer and exacerbate those experiences. So to name some of those internal factors, We know about the imposter phenomenon, right? I remember having a graduate student come to talk to me, many graduate students, but one in particular. I supervise our students I'm in a clinical doctoral program, who talked about a faculty member who just seemed like she thought she needed extra help and was like calling her in to do extra check-ins before she saw her first client, before she did her assessment. And it was exacerbating this feeling of like, I don't belong here, I'm not good enough. And we had to do a lot of conversation around letting that professor own their stuff. And it's hard as a faculty member. You don't want to call out your colleagues, but if you have a history, you know that this faculty member has a tendency to over-scrutinize students of color, right? I had to help her see, you're all going to be nervous. You're seeing your first client, you're doing your first assessment. And so she's reading your anxiety as, you can't do this. We know you can do this, right? So let her own her stuff. Let's focus on you doing your assessment, right? Because you can. And so helping students navigate it and naming what sometimes is happening. Stereotype threat was mentioned. Appropriated oppression is one I want to land on just for a moment. We often call it internalized oppression. Tappan and some other educational psychologists, and I have an article that just came out last year. We're pushing to use this language of appropriated oppression, and I think it helps us see how, as psychologists, as practitioners in general, as faculty members, we can understand how students might have appropriated or picked up ideas about themselves because of structural stigma and the narratives, rather than it being internalized oppression, like it's in them. Well, I can't excise that. As a psychologist, I can't extract stuff. I'm not a surgeon. But I can't interrupt learning, and we can help you maybe put this down or create some distance between yourself and that content and not see it as equal to who you are, fused with who you are. And so I like the language of appropriated oppression, because we all pick things up and appropriate things from systems of oppression, and we need to be thoughtful, and I think we have lots of knowledge to bring to bear on how we can interrupt that cycle. Racial identity, we understand understanding how our students understand themselves in terms of race is important, and that yes, by seeing race as more central to who they are, they might report experiencing more discrimination, but it actually can buffer them from the negative effects of it. And also to racialize our white students as well. It's not just students of color, right? And when I was a professor at a small liberal arts college before St. Louis University, we started a program called Engaging Diversity, where we brought all the white students who were willing to come to campus early, just like we bring students of color to campus early, international students. Because what we were finding is that it was white students who were not ready to engage diversity on a campus that was saying it wanted to engage diversity, that were causing some of the ruptures. So you bring students to campus early, students of color to campus early, get them comfortable, connected with different offices, then they go off to their dorms and they're only on their floor, and you have someone who like objectifies them and how they do their hair, or all those incidences and stories. So we really focused on helping white students think about, what does it mean to be white? How have I been socialized around whiteness, white supremacy, racism? How have I been socialized? And how am I preparing myself to be in this diverse environment? Not just students of color having the burden and the responsibility. Because representation isn't enough. Like even when we think about faculty of color having more, yes, we need them. But we need white faculty to also understand all these dynamics, because I don't need the extra service burden of carrying all of the responsibility. I'm happy to, of course, mentor my students of color, but we all need to be thinking about these issues. So I want to just close with a few comments, because I know we're running short on time. What we can do is to remind me to say we need to not be colorblind, right? We need to acknowledge that, as I mentioned at the beginning, race influences how students fare in the classroom. And so as faculty members, we can't just hope that the work is being done outside the classroom and on the university to make things equitable. We have to do the work. We also need to think about this fact of, this comes from Beverly Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, this idea of a moving walkway, that if the built landscape that we talked about at the beginning exists, it's built that way, it's moving that way. And so we have to not only work to see the way that it's moving and to name it, but right, with this walkway, you can't just be dismayed at the direction you're going. That's not going to change your direction. You got to think about, what do we do? Do we get off and re-engineer it? Do we move at the opposite speed at a faster pace? We have to be intentional about creating equitable environments so that students can flourish, not just being aware of the data and the disparities. Also acknowledge, this is the mouse and the elephant, in that as a faculty member, you are an elephant, you have power. And so we have to think about the fact that in these dynamics, we take up a lot of space. We can unwittingly and unknowingly trample the mouse, and our students need us to own our elephantness and see the ways in which either our own bias or the bias in our department or in the larger university is shaping their experience, and to speak up about it rather than just to, again, be dismayed and aware of it. And then finally, intent does not equal impact. We can intend all day long, and that's why the dashboards and the data are so essential, so that we can understand how we're doing, because we can have all the good intentions and still fall short. So thank you, I will stop there, and maybe we have time for questions.
Thank you. Please thank our presenters again for spending time with us and sharing their work with us. And although we ran out of time for questions, I'm assuming the presenters will be around throughout the day. So maybe catch them and give your responses to their presentations, ask questions, and also there's hashtags where you, for this conference where you can tweet about your reactions to the content we heard today. So now we can proceed downstairs. There's box lunches for us to enjoy.